sort of two teams. One team is kind of local and we look at local news and local problems, and one team is global, so we look at things on an international level. I work in the global team, but we look specifically on problems in the UK and how UK systems and people are enabling kind of oligarchs, dictators and kleptocrats to have kind of their money laundered and also their reputation laundered. I joined in the summer, and before that I was working in politics in Parliament. So it's still about kind of Parliament is all about scrutinising the government, and journalism in the same way is about kind of scrutinising the powers and scrutinising what's going on, or kind of public interest journalism, at least, that's what it's about. When I click through the slides, are you gonna, shall I click through?
If you're able to click through that, yeah, that would be great. Let's just take that little thing off there, and then you should just get, yeah.
So before we start and really get into it, just to ask a few of you in the room, and if you're on Zoom, if you just put it in the chat, but what kind of what issues motivate you and make you tick? What are you passionate about? You can speak to kind of your people that you're sitting next to. So what are you passionate about?
Well, issues motivate lack of attention to global issues.
Linear office professionals.
Climate.
Interesting. It's an important one, and probably going to be a kind of ever greater importance. Yeah.
Is there the more kind of context, I think.
What are your issues?
I'm interested in technology, so particularly at the moment what AI is doing and kind of implications for.
That's very kind of cutting edge and very kind of future forward looking.
Yeah, so particularly for like copywriting or creative, what the implications are for what that's doing.
Very interesting on whether kind of it's is it going to kind of add to or take away from creativity, I imagine.
Exactly.
And what are you?
It's very similar to what Alex said, but like I write as well sometimes. Like,
yeah.
Do a bit of screenwriting, and there's the WGA Writers Guild of America strikes at the moment with ChatGPT and potentially like taking over.
Interesting.
So that's
what you're kind of been kind of focusing on, and what sparked you recently. And the next question, have we got one in the chat? Fraser. Incarceration, policing and conspiracy movements. Very, very kind of relevant to what's going on in society at the moment. And the next question, if we're going to quickly do, is kind of a news headline you'd like to see this year. So it might be something about what you're kind of particularly interested in. It might be something you're concerned about. It might be about kind of maybe there's something that's affecting the community that you're in, your kind of friends and family. But what is there any kind of news headline that you'd particularly like to see this year that you can think of?
Southend United promoted to national.
Within the realms of possibility, I think.
I know, it's a fanciful.
Is there anything else that anyone would particularly, is an issue that's concerning you that you'd like reported on?
Party donations.
I think that's a kind of one that really needs to be scrutinised and kind of hasn't had the attention that it deserves. Something that I'd like to see is recently I've got a kind of friends, and they've got an autistic son, very, very autistic, gets a lot of kind of support from the state, and the parents were recently kind of taken to court, or they took the local government kind of got to court because the local government were trying to take away services to their son, and I think the local government spent about £15,000 on court fees and they lost. So I'd quite like a bit more scrutiny of what the local government is spending their kind of court fees on when it concerns children, disabled children. So that's something that I'd quite like to see.
Lucy.
Prison population in the UK shrinks. That would be amazing. You need to make that can be one of your goals, Fraser. You need that to kind of reporting to focus on that and what's going on and why it's happening and what drives it.
Another one from Cuckoo.
And then Coco. Oh, as a project manager, I support international investigative teams, human trafficking with local stories under a sort of umbrella story that tells about the European landscape. That's a really, really important one. And how is the government using public money? Again, really good. And the last one, this is a bit hard. So if you, rather than like discuss it, if you've got an idea, let me know. But is there anything, if we're kind of, because journalism, you've got to be, I mean, you recently, your last one was looking backwards. But when you're doing public interest journalism, a lot of it is looking forwards and what's going on. If you want to be cutting edge, you need to think about what's going to happen in the next few years. So what by kind of 2030, is there anything that you think that will be kind of top of the news agenda? And is there anything that you'd like to cover by 2030? Yeah.
The impact of how the banning of internal combustion engine cars, because the UK are banning them by 2030, every new car electric.
Yeah, that will definitely kind of change so much of our kind of the cities that we live in. And they'll have, and I bet you there'll be a lot of very good implications, but I imagine there'll be some kind of negative ones as well. So kind of scrutinising the good and the bad with that. Very good. Last UK, Fraser, you are, I like your dedication, you're really tenacious to the cause.
Something from Polly just above.
Polly, we've got blacklisting of union members in the UK coming out a little in the Spy Cops inquiry. Very interesting, lots of ideas. So moving on to the next slide is give you a bit of background quite quickly on the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. So as Ian said, we're independent, we're not for profit. At the moment, we're funded by kind of grants and kind of different, we make kind of applications to get our funding, but we're trying to diversify so that we have a bit more control over our money and therefore over the work that we do. We've been around, we've just turned into a teenager. We were founded in 2010. And the reason that we were founded, our founders wanted, kind of very concerned about the not, I don't want to say the death of, but just kind of journalist finances being squeezed and not having enough time to properly scrutinise the powers. And wanting to kind of hold people to account and really kind of get to grips with what's going on. As I mentioned before, we've got Bureau Local and Bureau Global as we do our work. So what to expect today? So we're going to cover collaborative journalism. We're going to cover impactful journalism. So how to make sure we're public interest and how to make sure that the investigations are making a difference. What we don't just want people to read our stories and kind of enjoy the story and then move on with their lives. We want to make sure that what we're doing has real tangible impact and makes a difference, whatever that difference may be. We're going to go over lots and lots of case studies as we do it and examples of different people who have done different things. I'm going to go over a story life cycle of how we operate and how you can operate. And then at the end, there's going to be some workshopping. So what I really want, why I'm doing this, one, to kind of inspire you. I know you've got some journalists here already, but those of you who are still students, I would love it to inspire you to follow a career in kind of collaborative, impactful, public interest journalism. And the second reason why my goal of today is to help you kind of to come up with ideas with you that you could then follow to kind of do that kind of initial planning stage, and that hopefully you could take forward to the next stages at a later date. So that's kind of my goals as well with the session. Okay, local news crisis. Give you a bit of a background information on this, which I'm sure you're all very, very well aware of. So as you all know, there's been kind of a crisis in local news. I think I've got some statistics for you, but we've got fewer local newspapers in the UK than any time since the 18th century, which means that local issues aren't being scrutinised to the extent that they should be scrutinised. There's a massive loss of trust in the news, a big kind of increase in fake news, and people don't believe that journalists are there to kind of help them. They think they're kind of chasing after money rather than kind of doing things for public interest. And there's more news ever online than before, and it's quite hard to monetize news when you're completely inundated with it. And the pandemic has only exacerbated the problem. And you've got there are some kind of papers that are bucking the trend. So you've got kind of Bristol Cable, Manchester Mill, Liverpool The Post, and one in Sheffield called The Tribune. So there are some that are kind of really recognising what the problem is and reacting to it. So there are lots of good people, if you're still a student, lots of good people that you can go and work for when you graduate. Okay. Next, old news model. Historically, kind of generally, newspapers were kind of like populated by kind of middle-class white elite, often very privileged, and often it would be a kind of male manager. And it was mainly about one-way communication. So you'd be reporting on something rather than reporting with people who are affected by the issue. So you'd make a decision on their community about what was important rather than actually listening to them and what they had to say. And if you needed a kind of case study, you'd kind of go in, cherry pick the case study that you thought was relevant, include it in your story, rather than really bringing the kind of the community in from the very beginning. As Ian was saying earlier, fierce competition, and there still is, but if you learn how to kind of collaborate and share information, it's only going to benefit you later on, and very much focused on profit. And now, with the kind of new, kind of the ones I was saying were bucking the trend, there's a kind of new model of journalism, which is who can kind of get involved, anyone who can tell an accurate, useful story. So there are a variety of organisations that are really trying to include people in their mission. I've got, you can see some of the logos from various ones at the bottom, which I don't know if anyone in the room has heard of the ones at the bottom. You've got the Meteor, Ferret, Gowdham and Disclose. But these are all kind of smaller, independent, public interest organisations. But very sadly, Gowdham, which I would really recommend you if kind of looking up after the session, it was started by students. And they were looking at people who had been marginalised and wanting to just tell their stories directly. But very sadly, Gowdham has recently closed because they couldn't get funding. But it does mean for people who are looking into what to do next, there's now a gap in the market. So go out and kind of start your own equivalent of Gowdham. And yeah, so it's a public interest, two-way communication, getting people on board that you're reporting on and getting them involved in the process. Reporting with people, and also focus on impact, which is going to, which for me is really important because that's what my role is, impact. So, Bureau of Investigative Journalism, very quickly, we are global, local. We've got 4 teams in the global, 4 main teams, and sort of some that are kind of in the process of being created, but the 4 main ones: global health, big tech, environment, and the enablers. We do a whole range of different stories. Bureau Local, we do, so I wanted to mention Bureau Local quickly. So what we do is but Bureau Local, there tries to be collaboration in both in all areas of what we do. In some teams it's a lot harder than others, particularly for my team because we're reporting on oligarchs and you can't really get them to tell their story. But we've got, with our Bureau Local, we've got a Slack channel, which I very much recommend joining. And we use that channel to share information and to ask for feedback. So to ask the community who are engaged with the Bureau about what they think is important, what they're concerned about, what we could do better. And we've also got lots and lots of resources that you can access, trying to kind of encourage everyone, or not everyone, but trying to encourage people to really get out there and get reporting. So I'd recommend just having a bit of a kind of browse on the resources that we've got available for you. Types of journalism, collaboration. So to give you kind of some ideas about what we mean when I'm talking about collaborative journalism, there are kind of, you can financially and structural, you can co-fundraise, you can share assets, you can share kind of knowledge on kind of knowledge sharing on models. So you might have a model of working, you can share that. And when I talk about assets, I'm talking about kind of, you can share the data side of it, or you can share kind of hardware assets, office space, equipment. So there's a whole kind of variety of things that you can do to make your life easier when you're working. And probably the most, potentially the most interesting side of it is the editorial side of it. That's really when you get to grips with the investigations and doing it kind of collaboratively. So that could be data sharing. And my team has just done quite a bit of this recently. Could be data gathering. And you could outsource your data gathering. I'm sure you have social media. It's a great kind of way of kind of tapping into different audiences to find out what's going on en masse. You could kind of mentoring different people, skill sharing. When you're doing a big investigation, there's like task allocations, so different people do different things, different people FOI different people, you can bounce ideas off each other. And what we do is co-publishing. So we never publish, well, we don't publish our investigations just us. We always work with a newspaper or kind of ITV or whoever we're doing it with when we're working, just so that we get a bigger audience. So I'm going to give you a few case studies. I'm sure you've all heard of Panama Papers, but this is a very, the collaborative side of this was very effective, and without collaboration it would have been impossible to fully kind of go through all the files. So there was what they still don't know who it was, but Panama is obviously a kind of country with very secretive arrangements for financial affairs, and it has been used by rich people around the world to hide their money. And somebody who was working in Panama, we don't know who it is, but he leaked, I think it was, I've got the figure written down, 2.6 terabytes of data, which is the biggest leak in history. And the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists got hold of this data, and they orchestrated a massive kind of asset sharing project to make sure that all the data was scrutinized and gone through with a toothpick. And they originally, when they published, they kind of focused only on kind of politicians and businessmen, and it resulted in the president of Iceland resigning because it turned out that he'd hidden a lot of his money and to avoid taxes overseas. And then what they did later is they made the data available for everyone to go through, so that there was more people, they had more eyes on it and more people to really work out what's going on. And that's an example of kind of collaboration working effectively. Another one that we've got is ProRepublica. Has anyone heard of ProRepublica before? So it's an American investigative newsroom, and they do a lot. It's all about public interest, and it's a lot of it. They've got a very well-developed impact model. So they really try, and everything that they do, they want to have a positive impact in the world. And they did a massive investigation called Reporting Hate over 3 years. So they recognised, they kind of looked around them, and they realised that after kind of the 2016 elections, there was a big increase in hate crime across America. But it was very, very poorly documented. The authorities weren't keeping track of it. There was no one really kind of looking into numbers, statistics, why things had increased, what the issues around it were, why it wasn't getting better. So they kind of started this new project, and they opened up the submissions. So people from across the states would submit their stories and explain to them what went wrong. And they also worked with a variety of different papers across the states and student papers to really kind of get as many stories as possible out of it and paint the full picture. They, in total, by the end of the 3 years, they told 230 stories on the subject, which I think is quite interesting, because it shows that when you've got an issue that you're really passionate about, Fraser prisons, you can really get to grips, and there's more. It's not going to be just one story. There's going to be a whole range of different angles that you can look at this from, and you really need to pull it in every single direction you can think of to fully understand and to paint the full picture of what's going on. Yeah, I hope that all kind of makes sense. And they also, going through it, just kind of to reading my notes, they also looked at not only kind of incidents and victims, but they also looked at kind of the police and why the police couldn't effectively deal with the problem, what the problem of it was, and also why it's so difficult to prosecute hate crime. Obviously, in America, you've got the First Amendment, which is really strong. Free speech is really strong. So in terms of when it's kind of verbal hate crime, it's incredibly difficult. And when it's violent, it's hard to kind of really document and kind of prove the motivation. So they kind of delved into that when they were working. Okay, this is just quite an interesting model of collaborative journalism. As I mentioned previously, local news is kind of there's a decline in quality local news, which means that at a kind of local level, decisions by councils and other kind of authority bodies aren't fully being scrutinised. So there's an initiative in the States, a big project called Documenters, powered by City Bureau kind of organise it, and it's all about training people to go out there and attend all the council meetings and document what's going on for kind of public record. And this is something that we don't have the same sort of project in the UK, and we're probably missing out. There's a bit of a kind of gap in the market, because there are like local council decisions aren't being scrutinised or documented to the level that they should. Yeah, this is something we did a big kind of a long investigation into Thurrock Council and money that had been squandered and poorly invested by Thurrock Council, and it resulted in kind of hundreds of millions of pounds that had gone missing. And if we'd have had something like the Documenters, money could have potentially been saved, and people would have benefited from that money, rather than it kind of going to one particular man who's fled to Dubai. We did a big investigation into Deliveroo, which I think really is quite a nice way of explaining how the Bureau operate collaboratively. So we wanted to write about kind of the kind of growing gig economy and the instability for some workers. So we started, the project was called, if I have got it in my notes, it was, I'll find it for you later, but there was a name for the project. But what we did is we kind of opened it up to our network. So we tried to get as much information from people as possible. We opened it up to our Slack channel. We opened it up, we kind of tweeted about it and really encouraged people to contribute their ideas to us of what they were concerned about with the kind of new more transitory model of working and gig economy. And we got loads. I think we got kind of 70 responses, and 70 people kind of submitted a little their own stories about what was going on, from like people working in microbreweries to care homes, from the use of toilets at work to kind of sick pay. So we've got a whole array of different stories, people telling us the different stories, and we kind of collated all that data and kind of identified key trends that people were concerned of. And we narrowed it down, and we ran we invited 10 different participants to an ideas lab to start brainstorming together about what the problem was and what was going on. And there were some, the image here is the ground rules for this ideas lab. And we worked with them, and we kind of paid, and resulted in us collaborating with delivery drivers and paying them to be to work for us as well. And we called them participant journalists. and we got them to kind of scope out issues. We got them to talk to people, to conduct interviews. So throughout the process of the investigation, we worked very, very closely with the delivery drivers, with the people that we were reporting on, to make sure that we were telling their stories kind of effectively and as honestly as possible. And we did, the whole process we collaborated on with the delivery drivers, including kind of developing a copy, so including the writing side of it. And moving on a little bit more to the impact of what we do. So after we did this big investigation into delivery drivers and gig economy, we published, and we not only do we empower the delivery drivers to go on strike and start kind of demanding their own rights, but also delivery was floated on the stock market a month or so later, and investors pulled out as a result of this story. And when it was floated, it was kind of down by 14% over what people had anticipated it to be. So it really shows the managers at Deliveroo that they can't treat their workers like that, and journalists will come kind of sniffing about to try and make sure that they're treating people fairly. So that was kind of a big investigation that we did. And this is one that my team has done very recently. So we looked into a brand, and we managed to get, there was a big data leak. There was some kind of hackers on the internet called Freaky, a group of hackers, and they managed to get some information. I'm not gonna suggest that anyone should go and hack in any way, but when there are these leaks, it does provide you with a lot of kind of data that you can then analyze and get stories out of. So there was, in Cyprus, has become a bit of a hub for kind of very rich people using it to hide their money and to kind of get to hide their money. And there was one of the big kind of service providers in Cyprus is called Merit Service. And the Merit Service was hacked and all the data was leaked. And we, along with, there was a kind of consortium of journalists, including people like Washington Post, The Guardian, OCCRP, and we who all had access to the data and could all kind of analyse it together. And you really need, like in kind of Panama Papers, this is on a smaller scale, but you really need journalists to be working with, because when you've got kind of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of data, you just don't have the capacity to go through it all yourself. So you need people to help you go through it. And the story was that we got is there were, I don't know if anyone's a particular football fan, but Abramovich there'd long been rumours about Abramovich funding the Dutch football club Vitesse, and there had been a variety of investigations into these Abramovich's financial arrangements, but they'd never managed to prove the link between Vitesse and Abramovich. And we managed to prove that link. And it was argued by the manager at the time that the reason that this Dutch football club didn't qualify for the Champions League is because Abramovich didn't want it to, because he was using this club as a training ground. So that's the kind of collaboration side of it. Now on to the impact side, and I'm going to go more into the impact side in a bit more detail in just a moment. But off the back of this investigation, there has been a white paper that's been released by DCMS, which is the Department of kind of Culture, Media and Sport, into football regulation. And what we've trying to do is we're using this investigation to try and really push for better regulation and for the accounts to be fully scrutinised. So we're working with an NGO to come up with a kind of use this story as a case study for what the government should do and how they should effectively set up a regulation body. And that is an example, that's an example of kind of the impact that we want of our investigations. So this, I just put this slide up here because it kind of has lots of similarities with a few of the stories in terms of a massive amount of data. And does everyone know about kind of the lockdown files and what happened? So basically, what it was is Matt Hancock agreed with Isabel Oakeshott. What Isabel Oakeshott was going to kind of ghostwrite a book for him on kind of the pandemic and to try and get his story across. And he curiously gave a journalist of kind of all of his complete access into his WhatsApp and into his private life, which is an interesting thing to do if you know kind of journalists, and if they, not that you shouldn't trust journalists, but journalists question what they're given. And what Isabel Oakeshott did, it was 100,000 WhatsApp messages. And Isabel Oakeshott, after she'd written the book, she then took it to the Telegraph. Interestingly, she kind of was a Times journalist, so she took it to a different paper, which is an interesting decision. And what the Telegraph did is they published a lot of the texts that they thought were really inflammatory. And they kind of ran, it was over a week, and each day they kind of published different aspects of the story. It's something that I know that Ian was saying that you recently, I don't know if you guys were in this session, but you did a course on, you covered law, journalism and defamation recently. But this is very, very risky behaviour, because you're opening yourself up. And if you do go into investigative journalism, there are lots of kind of legal risks that you need to kind of be aware of when you're doing it, because you're absolutely opening yourself up to get done for kind of an invasion of privacy. You're kind of breaking kind of confidentiality, because she had an agreement with him about the book deal. There's a lot of kind of risk that Isabel could be sued as a result of this, and we'll have to wait. We've got a year after publishing to be sued, so it'll be really interesting what Matt Hancock does. But what kind of the journalist Oakeshott has done is she's now threatening that if he does sue her, she's threatening to publish even more kind of defamatory material about him, which I think kind of, in my personal opinion, but I'd be interested, you might have a different opinion to me, it does slightly undermine your public interest defence if you're using certain nuclear bits of information, the threat of releasing certain nuclear bits of information to sue and to stop someone suing you. So what kind of Oakeshott didn't do is she didn't collaborate with other journalists when she published this. It was just the Telegraph. So they didn't kind of, they didn't have a kind of overall, they kind of kept the scoop to themselves. And also what they haven't done is they didn't, when they published the messages, they didn't publish all the messages, they published select messages. And when you're talking about the legal side of things, meaning is really important. And if you don't publish all messages, you could be missing out on important nuance. So not only is that making it kind of excessively risky, but you're also kind of not allowing other journalists to really go through it and scrutinise. So in my personal opinion, it would have been much better if she'd have collaborated, or she'd have at least, there'd been some sort of kind of publishing among other journalists of the information so that other people could really go through it and see if there's anything she was missing. So this is an example where it wasn't collaborative journalism, but I think that it could have been, and it would have benefited from. Okay. So questions. So just have you ever kind of collaborated in your work that you're doing? And can you think of any other kind of any other examples of collaboration in journalism?
I haven't on this scale. I mean, sometimes in a newsroom you might have a story and you're going to do a special, and it's different.
It's different than doing the whole investigation together and really getting people's stories.
If Isabel Oakeshott came to you now to collaborate, what would you do?
That's really interesting. So you wouldn't want, there's loads and loads of dilemmas, and I think you'd have to have a real conversation about what to do. So there's the public interest aspect of it. They were discussing really important decisions. People kind of died as a result of decisions being made by Matt Hancock. And these decisions should be scrutinised, and people need to go through it so that lessons can be learned for the future. So there's a massive, massive public interest defence if it got to that level, but motivation for publishing. At the same time, Matt Hancock was a source. and he had reasonable right to privacy when he handed over all that information. And it also, if you were to publish it, if you had been given all these files, you'd slightly worry that other sources wouldn't think that you were trustworthy, and you wouldn't want to kind of open yourself up to criticism. So I think there's not an easy answer, and it would take a long time. I think probably the public interest aspect of it would be kind of overwhelming, and you'd have to publish the files because they're so important. And equally, I think it's different. When you're kind of discussing sources, it's very different when you're talking about a source who's someone who's in power, when you're thinking about a source who's someone who doesn't have the power. And seeing as Matt Hancock was one of the most powerful people in the United Kingdom during the pandemic, making those decisions, making all those decisions, I think you have to treat it slightly differently, and you have to really acknowledge the position that he was in, and the impact that he had on people's lives. So I think we probably would kind of publish it, but we'd publish everything. We wouldn't cherry pick, and we wouldn't threaten to publish more as a way of blackmailing someone, because that kind of seems very, very immoral, in my opinion. Okay, just if you wanted to kind of learn a bit more about kind of collaborative journalism, there's Ian will share the slides, but there's some links here. If you go onto the kind of collaborative media in the US, Centre for Collaborative Media in the US, there's loads and loads of really good resources. So if you want to kind of learn more about collaboration in journalism, I'd really recommend you going onto their website and kind of having a read of all their resources.
Sarah, I mentioned to you, these are the people I'm going to try and visit.
Oh, wow.
I've got some research leave next semester. I'm going to try and visit.
Fantastic. That's really good. Yeah, they've got this is kind of the kind of chart that they have, the big kind of overview of how it is, and you can actually go into each and every topic and get more information on there. Now we're going to move on to impact. So sort of collaboration is one aspect of it, and impact. So when a few kind of questions for you and for the kind of people who have joined us virtually, is that when do you think, with impact, when do you think you should kind of think about impact? At what stage of your reporting, and what kind of impact are you thinking about? I know that we've got someone who's very kind of interested about kind of prisons. But what, like, when do you think impact happens in reporting? Yeah, so when you obviously kind of don't know what's going to happen off the back of it, but it's a good idea to really understand, if you're reporting on, as you normally do in investigative journalism, there's a problem and you're trying to understand it fully, is you want to kind of have an idea of what the possible outcomes would be. And as a newsroom at the Bureau, if we don't think that there's going to be good impact off the back of a story, we just won't touch it. So we had, there was, following the kind of oligarch files, there was another story that we could have pulled out of that, which I think it was us who had found it, but other kind of newsrooms were going to be writing about it, and we actually decided that there wasn't actually any point, even though it was a good story. We decided that because there wasn't impact and because we couldn't see how it was going to make a difference, that we wouldn't waste our time on it. So we used to think about it at the very beginning, and you kind of brainstorm about it. And so we have, when we're kind of thinking about impact of the Bureau, we kind of follow these ABCs. So we want actual evidence to the right people in the right format at the right time. So it's not for us, I mean, it always is in journalism, you want as many reads as possible, you want as many people to read it, but that isn't, we try and make that not be a driving kind of motivation for our work. Instead of it being read by however many people who don't have any kind of proper import, or it's not going to make a difference if they read it. We try and make sure that the stories that we produce are kind of in the right format to the right people. So my colleague was looking into tobacco farming in America and how the workers on the farms were being abused and treated really, really poorly, and they were immigrants from Mexico, and they didn't feel like they had any rights, and they didn't know what their rights were. So when we were writing this story, we published it in the normal way, but we also tapped into all their WhatsApp groups, and we shared this information with the farmers so that they knew what their rights were and they knew how to assert their rights. And even the way that we wrote the story, we really simplified it so that it could be kind of understood if there's low literacy levels, so that it can be understood by the people who it actually matters to, and making sure that they're more informed off the back of it. As I said earlier, you wanted a big reach, you wanted to generate conversation. You want collaboration with different change drivers. That's really important, because kind of when you're thinking about kind of bigger issues and things happening on a larger scale, you need different people doing different things. So you probably need the advocacy groups who are particularly good at kind of advocating. You need potentially the lawyers who are very good at making the legal arguments. You need journalists who really kind of get to grips and fully explain what the problem is. So there's a lot of different people. If you want to make change, there's a lot of different people who are involved in the process. Drum banging over a long period. When we publish, we try and not immediately forget about it and move on to the next issue. We want to make sure that our stories are still relevant later down the line, which is what we're doing with the Abramovich story. Now that we've published, we're now working with different NGOs who are trying to influence the regulation body. We're kind of working with politicians who have kind of influence over that kind of regulation body. Engaging with affected communities. If you're particularly interested in, maybe it's kind of farmers and maybe people working on the farms coming over and how they're treated. I think we had a human slavery one in the chat earlier. If you're particularly interested in that aspect of things, it's working with the people who are experiencing the problem. And one of the most important aspects of it is feelings. It's making sure that your story is, I'm sure you know, but it's all about humans, the human tale of this. With my team, because we report on kind of corruption and financial matters, it's really, really hard to have a human side to the story, because there's not often a clear victim. Sort of with matters relating to tax fraud, everybody misses out. You don't have but you don't have one victim that you can really kind of tell the story of and make people empathize with and engage with. But people need to be, whatever you do, basically, people need to be at the heart of your storytelling. And I'm going to give you a few examples of different kind of stories that we've done, which showcase the kind of impact that we would like and what I kind of am referring to. So two of my colleagues did a really big project into health inequality. This started off during the pandemic. They thought the question that I asked you at the beginning of what kind of will be the headlines that you want to see in 2023, they saw kind of the pandemic exacerbating health inequality, and they wanted to report on this and kind of raise awareness about the issue. And when they did this, they engaged with kind of communities, affected communities. They engaged with people who are disabled. Then they engaged with charities that were run by people who are disabled and were supporting people who were disabled. And they made sure when they were reporting not just to include quotes by kind of white middle class experts, which happens quite frequently, but to get everyone's kind of side and everyone's perspective in it. And when this man here is a man called Peter Kilroy, and as you can see, he is an amputee. And one of the stories that they published in this project was about kind of, they FOI'd, I think, every council in the UK to find out how kind of grants were being given to people who were disabled, who needed special modifications in their home. And just about how long it took and about the kind of hurdles to get there. And this Peter has been on the waiting list for about 2 years, and he was waiting for an occupational therapist to come in and assess him. And as a result of the story, the process sped up and he was given his modified kitchen. So he no longer had to kind of take his kind of leg off and sit in his wheelchair to use his oven. So it doesn't have to be, when you think about impact, it doesn't always have to be a massive kind of legislative scale. There's also kind of impact on kind of everyday person's lives. And if you make one person's life a difference in one person's life, I think that is important and it's worthwhile what you're doing. Another one that we did, it's not coming up. Is we looked into, this is on the global team. So this is an example of not only kind of collaboration with people internationally, but also about impact. And my colleague was looking at, we had a project called Big Tobacco. We had lots of funding to investigate the tobacco industry. And my colleague was very concerned that cigarettes were being marketed at children, which is happening in the UK as well. If you look at Elf bars and their bright colours, and their fun flavours, it's targeting a young audience. And he was looking into this in Peru, in Lima. And what he did is he managed to run the project with different schools across Lima and engage the children, the teenagers, to be their own journalists. And to go out there and take pictures anytime that they saw some cigarettes next to some bubble gum in bright colours. He got them to take pictures of this, and doing that is a really good way to outsource the issue of reporting, because all the teenagers and children were doing it. It was also a really good way because the target audience, when you're thinking about impact, you want the children to be aware of the problem and not be tempted by like cherry bubblegum flavoured cigarettes. So it's a good way of like raising awareness with the affected community and getting them more involved in journalism. We want a kind of part of our motivation is trying to make sure that you make journalism accessible to people. It's one of the reasons why we all go out to universities and chat to students, because you want everyone to be involved with it. And it's a way that he did that. And as a result of this, not only is there kind of increased awareness in the schools, the children knowing what the problem is, but there's also been some legislative scrutiny and it's been used. I think Peru politics is a mess. But he's managed to engage kind of politicians on the matter as well, to raise the profile at a legislative level. And this is one of my team's stories. And this is, I mean, we weren't expecting this impact off the back of this story. But last year, February last year, we reported about the former dictator of Kazakhstan is a man called Nazarbayev. Nazarbayev is incredibly corrupt. He is a massive kind of human rights abuser of the Kazakh people. And he kind of ruled with an iron fist for decades. We found a shell company in the UK called Juicing Technologies Limited, which was being used to channel money from a kind of foundation in Kazakhstan named after the president, called the Nazarbayev Foundation. And the money was being funneled through the UK. We didn't say that we didn't actually even kind of say outrightly that there was any we didn't make any assertions that there was any corruption involved in this, but we just documented the structure and where the money was coming from. And with with the Ukraine war, money flowing from former kind of Soviet states should be fully scrutinized. And this is what we were doing. And after we published this story, we then kind of got letters before action, and we've now been served off the back of it, which means that we're now being sued for writing this. We were being sued by the fund, Nazarbayev Fund, and Juicing Technologies Limited. Nazarbayev Fund, because they claim, one of their arguments is that they're not linked to Nazarbayev, and that kind of mars and tarnishes their reputation, despite being called the Nazarbayev Fund. And we're being sued along with the Telegraph, and we were Open Democracy, if you've heard of Open Democracy, and an organisation in the States called OCCRP. which do lots of corruption reporting. And I would recommend, if you're interested in this sort of thing, I definitely recommend looking them up. And in the States, they were also being sued. But off the back of that, and I know that Ian was talking to you last week about kind of slaps and talking to you about lawsuits against journalists and the kind of modern way of censoring media. It's no longer by the government. It's often by kind of the rich and the powerful who've got money to sue you. Because of the lack of money in journalism, that you don't have the finances to fully defend yourself. When you're kind of in a newsroom, you've got more support and you've got insurance and you've got people who are experienced with this type of thing. But if you don't, if you're a student journalist, if you run your own kind of investigative newsroom, it doesn't even have to be investigative, you run your own blog, if you're reporting on rich and powerful people, even if you are absolutely convinced that the information that you've got is correct, and you hope you'd be able to rely on a truth defence, you are opening yourself up to getting sued, which is really scary and a massive problem for journalism. And this is what's happened to us, but we've used the opportunity of us getting sued to really get into a campaign group which is fighting against these lawsuits, these SLAP lawsuits, and we're quite we've had promises from the government that they're going to legislate against this issue, and Labour have said that they're going to include the issue in their manifesto. So at some point, I don't know whether it will be before this election, the next election, but we are really pushing to get legislation. So this is a kind of impact that we weren't expecting, but we're hoping that there'll be some big impact off the back of it. And when we've been working with the anti-SLAP movement, it's another example of kind of collaboration. If you're just a lone voice, you're not going to kind of create change, because there aren't enough of you making enough noise in the greater scheme of things. But we've got a whole array of different NGOs. We've got kind of different journalists really kind of fighting this cause with us. And you can all kind of use your own areas of expertise when you're doing this work. So there's Greenpeace is really on it because they're reporting on rich kind of oil companies or fossil fuels or whoever it is, often with a lot of money. Greenpeace often gets sued, and so they're massively pushing for legislation. There's some think tanks who are also pushing. There's a Guardian journalist. I don't think the Guardian is officially, they join a lot of the things, but there's one journalist in the Guardian, one editor, who's massively in favour of legislation, is trying to kind of shape the conversation around what's going on to continue to push. And you need like lots of different people working on it for it to be effective. So impact strategy. So when I kind of covered this a bit before, but when we are thinking about our impact from the very beginning, we need to be thinking about who do we want to reach, why do we need to reach them, and how do we need to reach them? So if you take the Lima example with the cigarettes, it was very much at the front of the journalist's mind from day one what the problem was, who he needed to reach, how he was going to reach them, and why reaching the kids was important. And you have to, like, as I kind of said earlier, you've got kind of the old style reporting, which is more reporting on someone, and the new style is reporting with. You can see how when you're thinking about impact, you can massively expand the impact you have by just getting other people involved with your stories. And it makes it, when you're talking about, if you've got a massive amount of information to go through, if you're kind of working in a small area but want to work out what's going on in the different areas across the UK, you can hopefully see how it's very effective to have lots of people working on a similar issue to really get to the bottom of what's going on. One of the questions, which, I mean, probably you could have a longer debate on this, is the question of impact versus activism. Because when you're reporting, you try very hard to make sure that you're never biased in what you do. Because the minute you're biased, you're closing yourself off for different possibilities, and you're not seeing the bigger picture, which is you're always trying to kind of understand the bigger picture. So it is quite a hard, you're kind of walking on a tightrope when you're discussing the difference between activism and impact. And when I think about the difference, what we try and do is it's really hard because there are some issues like the SLAP issue that we've really kind of got behind and we've taken a side on and we're trying to push. But you're just making sure that with investigative journalism, you're getting accurate information. And when you've got the information, you're getting that information in front of the right people. So whether that's kind of policymakers, whether that's a kind of committee, whether that's your local councillor, whether that's some sort of kind of social services, kind of the board of a social services department, whoever it is, you want accurate information in front of the right people, and that will hopefully spark impact off the back of your reporting. And this is just included this because it was just released last week. But Amnesty International run media awards, and one of their awards is the Impact Award. And the story that won was a story published in the Sunday Times called I Made a Mistake, Why Should My Son Pay? And it's all about ISIS brides who went over and joined the caliphate, and they're now being held in massive and quite scary camps. And the UK has, as I'm sure you know, that is stripping kind of citizens, if they can, of their citizenship so that they're not kind of repatriating them back to the UK. And if you haven't, has anyone read this story in the Sunday Times? If you haven't read it, I'd really, really recommend reading it. So Christina Lamb is the journalist, and she, I imagine, asked the question that I asked you at the beginning of what story does she want to see in the next 2022. And she kind of realised that these women's stories weren't being told. So she visited the camps and she told the stories of these kind of, it's very kind of sad situations of the women and children who are trapped. And there's a massive debate going on on a political level about whether or not we should accept the citizens back, the British citizens or formerly British citizens back, and we should take responsibility for what happened. At the moment, the government is firmly not accepting the citizens back. And this is against kind of, I've got a list if you're interested of kind of the Netherlands, Canada, the States. A lot of different countries are so you've got US, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, Austria, Finland and France have all repatriated their citizens. So we're one of the few countries that isn't taking them back, and isn't there's an argument if you were under 18 that you were, or kind of over 18, but there's an argument of kind of grooming and human trafficking, and also the children who didn't have a choice who were taken over there. We're still not accepting any responsibility, and we're not even having it would be played out in courtrooms in the UK, and they would probably, the women, if they returned, would be tried for terrorism, but we're not even kind of trying them. The recent court case around it was all about whether or not it was legal for Shamima Begum's citizenship to be stripped. So it wasn't about whether or not she had committed a crime or not, it's whether or not the UK government could strip her citizenship. But it's definitely worth a read. And it shows, it's like if you're thinking about impact, you're kind of looking at the world and seeing different problems, and seeing whose story needs to be told, whose stories aren't being told. And it's a very compelling story, and very compelling for putting the human side of it, so people at the heart of it. You really empathise with the people that she's writing about, which is, I couldn't underline it enough when you're telling a story, is the importance of being able to empathise with the characters. This is a kind of a life cycle of a story. So this was done for, it's the diagram was for a Change the Story project of Bureau Local. So this is looking at kind of local issues as they were doing it. It's kind of, sorry, it's cut off a bit on the side, but it's all about kind of surfacing issues, scoping and testing. So working out what's going on, and bringing it to your network. So speaking to people, as many people as you can about what's going on. If you've got a big social media kind of presence, or maybe you're part of a community online, actually asking the community what they think about what you're doing and what they think, if there's anything that you're missing, is really important. Kind of forming a coalition, getting people on board, developing the story, telling the story, and making sure there's like lasting impact and change. So it's when you kind of do these kind of big investigations, there's a lot of different processes and different steps to the work that you do. It's very different, I imagine, because you were saying that you work in kind of the BBC in Newcastle, and you, I imagine, don't have as much time to really get to grips with the story and really kind of delve very deep into what's going on. You'll kind of have to, I imagine, under a lot of pressure to get information out there as quickly as possible. So it's a different way of working, and we're very privileged at the Bureau that because we've got because of our funding model, we've got more time to spend on each story that we do. And how to set up collaborative and impactful journalism. So you've got to identify who needs to be part of the collaboration, identify how to hear these voices, how are you going to get in touch with the communities, particularly if you're, for example, there's a diaspora community that you're wanting to work with. What's the best way of really understanding their community? Think about why someone would want to be, what's in it for them. Quite often they may, if they've got quite a negative impression of kind of journalism, they might not ever see their stories being heard. And they might be quite like wary of engaging. So why would they want to? It's kind of, you've got to be a good salesperson, or maybe kind of convincing people of the importance of the work. So what platforms, thinking about how you're going to actually bring it together and how you're going to manage these relationships. Agree on who the story needs to reach. How best to reach these audiences. Is it through WhatsApp groups? Is it through comics? Is it through, maybe there's a game on your phone that you could communicate with people through? Think about when you kind of have written the story, how to move on constructively. You don't just want to kind of drop into a community's problem and then leave. You want to really try and make sure that you empower them to continue beating that drum on your behalf. And reflect once you've done that, obviously kind of reflecting on what impact the story could have locally, and what the end result was, and whether you've been effective, and what more you could do or you should have done as you go through it. We're going to do kind of the last 20 minutes, we're going to do a bit of workshopping. But do you have, before we move on to the workshopping, are there any questions?
I think there just was a couple of questions just online at this stage. Let's see, one was really about, do you have any examples of collaborations with local news organisations? Are you able to share examples of collaborations within newsrooms, especially local newsrooms, when different teams have varied skill sets and work on overlapping news patches?
Yeah, so when we, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but we do a lot of kind of local newsroom reporting. One of the ways that we do it is on our Slack channel. When there's an issue, we'll kind of share the data, share how we've done it, and try and encourage. It's full of kind of over 1,000 journalists or academics or students, and we try and get them to take maybe our model or take some of our information and apply it to their area. So that's one of the ways that we do it. There was also, we had, this was kind of a few years ago, but we kind of had done all the research for a particular story and had all the data that they could apply to their different local areas. And then we kind of try and get in touch with the local newsrooms and hand out kind of the data, and they just had to kind of write it up. But I remember it was one of the local papers, they simply didn't have the staff to even write up the story, which really does show how kind of stretched local newsrooms are, that if you're basically given all the data, you just need to pull it together. Even in that side, you struggle. Yeah, so I'd say that with our Slack channel, it's a lot about kind of local news and collaborating with journalists on a local level, and to discuss kind of matters of public interest in different local areas. Okay, so workshopping. What we're going to do in the last 20 minutes of this session is we're going to think about different issues and how you might go about working on them. So the first thing I'd like you to do, you can do it either like by yourself or in kind of pairs, is I want you just to take kind of 5 minutes and think about what you think the biggest stories are. And these may be relevant to a community you belong to, or an issue you feel deeply about. So it might be to do with maybe a kind of online group that you're a part of. It might be to do with kind of your community. It might be your church, your mosque, your synagogue. It might be kind of your group. Maybe you work on at the university. Maybe you're part of the student paper. It might be to do with like whatever the community is there an issue, or what issues are you what are there any stories that you can think of, or things that you would like to kind of delve deeper into?
See, under pressure, it's interesting that your mind goes completely blank.
Yeah. But tell me, it is really hard. Are there things that so you were saying that you are working on, you were kind of listing to me the different stories that you make videos on. Is there anything that you thought, oh, that's really interesting, you could do that on a wider scale? Or that person's problem, I'm sure they're not the only person who has that problem. Is there any way that we could like get more data on this and really understand the bigger picture of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, it would be more down to the format. So different people are going to engage with different aspects of multimedia. So some people will engage more of a picture-led story versus something textual that they'll read versus audio versus visual.
Yeah.
And it's how do you engage with different demographics through those different mediums whilst communicating the same thing without missing out certain bits of context.
Yeah, interesting.
That's a really
so different like form of communication.
Yeah.
Do you have any at the back, any ideas?
So this is something I'm currently working on for my dissertation, but cases of sports hooliganism. Especially about in popular sports news and sports marketing.
Very interesting.
So like in popular sport events, sporting venues, arenas, and the effects of.
That's really interesting, and I like that because you could do it on a local level, but then you could expand it and kind of do it on like different people. You could get different clubs looking at different aspects, and it could be expanded quite easily. That's a really good idea. Are you particularly passionate about sport then?
Yeah, I do like sports news. Like that's something I've been delving into. I would like to see the social and sport parts.
Very interesting. Very good idea. Yeah, so I said my issue that I think just because it's happened recently, but the local council is spending £15,000 to take the parents of a child who's very disabled to court to try and take away his benefits. For me, that is absolutely shocking, and I'd be really interested just how much money local councils are spending on expensive lawyers instead of on the support for the children. And I think if you could find a way of getting that data, you could do it as a kind of a local level, or you could FOI lots of different people, you could create like a coalition to do it with. I think that's something that I would definitely like more reporting on.
There's a suggestion on
I would like to work on the cost of the Home Office visa applications. There was a Guardian story a few years ago on how the profit margins are. That's really interesting. Yeah, I'd be it's kind of fascinating just how much money it costs and visas cost, and particularly depending on who's paying. If you're looking at kind of people who have come, kind of refugee communities getting visas, it's going to be very, very, very expensive for them, and the process is so incredibly difficult. I think there's probably a lot on visa applications that you could investigate. It's such a kind of complicated process for people, and people are kind of messed around so much in the process I think you could tell the human stories when you're doing that. You could find people who have struggled, who have been rejected for whatever reason, and you could also get the data and do to back it up. Is there a link between state care and incarceration? There is. And if there is, how would we break that link? That's another really good idea, because you can see how that would play out it's kind of over the course of the whole investigation. You get the kind of people who have been in prison and get them to tell their stories, which are going to be really compelling and really probably in a lot of cases very, very kind of sad. And when you really, it's kind of with the prisoners, and probably, Fraser, I feel like I'm kind of what I'm saying, you already are very well informed. But when you've just got numbers and statistics, you kind of don't really understand the impact on a human level. But the minute you start like telling the stories and people kind of understand why you've behaved in a certain way, they might have a very different opinion of whether or not you should be in prison. So I think you've got a massive project on prisons, Fraser, to do. So next is, so when you've thought about whatever your idea is just to take a bit more time. And we've sort of discussed this already, but like think about like the impact that your idea could have if reported well. So is it going to be about increased awareness, challenging the stereotype, changing a policy, putting pressure on decision makers? Because I worked in Parliament before, and so it's one of the things about being a journalist is like understanding the system. So I think if I'm allowed to give you a little like nugget of advice as we go through this, but if anyone can go and get a job with working for an MP, if you're not sure what to do when you graduate, just get a job working for your kind of local MP, because it really does give you a wide range of experiences, and you'll see you'll learn a lot about how the system works. So I think everyone, it'll be really useful for lots of people to do, because once you understand how the powers work, you can more effectively scrutinise them, and also you understand the communities and you'll understand different communities. But if you know about sort of like what's going on and what the issues are and whether there's a certain inquiry, that could be one of your impact goals as well. We've sort of discussed that a little bit, but does anyone else have anything that with their idea that they'd like to add in terms of impact and what impact you'd like from an idea that you have? If anyone's got anything, but we've sort of discussed it.
Just something you and I touched on earlier, Lucy, was the best impact is achievable impact.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be massive. If you there's so many problems with society and it can get really overwhelming. So if you make it kind of small and manageable, then you're more likely to achieve it and be motivated. So whether it's just kind of getting the kitchen of a man who was disabled kind of redone so that he could actually use it effectively, it's a small area, but it makes a big difference. I know with your hospital examples and the lack of volunteers, you've got a kind of clearly defined issue, and there is a clearly easily to imagine solution, is that there are more volunteers and they're kind of properly supported in the hospital so that they can do their job effectively and help people. So the last workshop before we finish up is we're kind of running a bit out of time, so maybe this should be something that you could fully do at a later date. But when you've got your story idea, here are kind of 8 steps. If you're thinking about working and wanting impact, and you're thinking about collaboration, here are kind of the 8 steps that I mentioned previously that you could go through when you're planning it. To think about, maybe it will help you kind of think about different aspects or think about different people, and really sort of to see it on a wider scale. But that's quite a good kind of little format to run through. So what I've done here, but I don't know whether I haven't done it effectively fully, because you've sort of run out of time.
I've done a QR code for it.
You've done a QR code, amazing. But I've made a Google Drive where you can put, if you've got a idea on a story and you'd like someone to help you with it, shall I click on it so that everyone can see? But there is a Google Drive that I have done, And if you'd like, I've shared it with kind of everyone who has joined us today. And if you've got an idea that you'd like anyone to you'd like people to collaborate with you on and do it together, you can put in your story idea. If you put in kind of your email address, you can get in touch with people who might like to work on a similar kind of investigation with you.